Hey folks, welcome to another For the Love of History. Today we're excited. We've got the authority around Columbus and Phoenix City, John Lupo. John, we're glad that you're with us today.
Thank you.
And we understand that we've got to make the best of today because you might not be back. So I don't want to say that, but that's what you know. But anyway, and my old friend Rodney Hinton, I think, you've seen him on the show before. I told him a while ago, I just feel so little, so dumb, so stupid sitting between these two guys. These guys are history. I mean, they know history.
We are history.
We're
historic.
You're historic.
Yeah.
But I know a little history, and these guys just go like that. So I kind of didn't even want to sit up here because it's embarrassing sitting between these two. But what we did on the other two shows is we just kind of did an overlay of history of Russell County. And what we're going to do is we're going to zero in on some of these items that we talked about, some of these like the Horace King and things like that we just briefly hit on. And so I'm going to quit talking, and I know y'all are proud of that, and turn it over to Rodney, or Dr. Hinton, excuse me.
Rodney.
I've known him as Rodney all of his life.
That's perfect.
But anyway, we appreciate you being here. We really do, and we really appreciate you bringing John with you.
Well, I told Steve early on when he asked me to do this, I said I'll be glad to do it, but I want to bring some people that know a lot more than I do. And I also made the point that a lot of people claim to be historians and pretend to be authorities, but history doesn't work that way. There are a lot of authorities. And Tommy Boswell, who's going to be on with us, we're going to run 2 or 3 shows that we're going to film today and show them as 2 or 3 different segments with John about particularly the Girard, Columbus, Phoenix City river area, about how all of this developed. Then we'll follow up with Tommy going deeper into the county. And Tommy brings so much in-depth knowledge about the Indian history and also other parts of Russell County history and local communities. So we're excited about that. We are very fortunate to have John. John works really hard at being retired because everybody wants him to do something. He's continually, people are asking him to write. He called me the other day. He was working on a guide for the upcoming tour of Linwood Cemetery. One of the last major things he did that he wanted to finish up was the plaques that you see down at the Mott House, which are excellent, and it's unbelievable research that went into that. John came into this area in the 70s to be a professor at Columbus College at the time, a history professor, and he also started the archives over there. Don't get confused when you say, that's not John Lupo. I mean, that's not Larry Lupo. No, it's not Larry Lupo from Phoenix City. It's John Lupo from South Carolina, and they talked together and worked together for many years. John ended up heading up the department again, building the archives, and becoming an authority. He's written so much. He's got 2 annotated bibliographies that he did, very thick volumes, one on Georgia, one on Alabama, that's just a basic when you're doing research on any topic in these areas. He's done a history of Columbus. He was part of the HARE research, which is the national engineering group that went into the mills. He authored a report that got Bibb City put on historic sites, and we might even talk about that a little bit, which is very interesting too. You say, well, he's a Columbus historian. Well, he also wrote the definitive book along with Tom French on Horace King, and we're going to talk a lot about Horace King and the fights between Alabama and Georgia over the river today. He's very much an authority on those. We have a third friend who has to still work, but Jesse Williams, who was a student of John's, maybe the best researcher in this area, and he and John both would probably share that title, but they have different skill sets even in research. We've got some very talented people, but to have John come to us today and give us his time is a real honor. You're going to see just how knowledgeable he is. And with that, let's start off at the river. You know, you heard the old saying, go west, young man, go west. Well, we were the West. This was the West. and the leaders in Georgia flocked to this border to be sitting on the race line to get some of this Alabama territory and to move west, and the federal road moved people west, particularly down in the New Orleans area. So you hear go west and you think about wagon trains or Texas or California. Well, the first rush to the west came through Georgia into Alabama. And we're sitting here, and we're going to talk a little bit about the struggles that went on there, because you got to understand that to understand the history of Georgia and the history of Alabama. And the early leaders overlapped these lines. These lines really existed only in terms of political power and other things, but the people actually lived on both sides of the river at different times. We're going to talk about how Ingersoll was probably the first white settler that originally was living in Columbus, but had a trading post on the Alabama side of the river, up on the Dillingham Hill, where the Methodist and Baptist Church sat. And then Horace King and John Godwin came in, and Godwin ended up living originally in Columbus and then moving up on that hill. So we're going to start off with Ingersoll and Godwin and King, and we're going to spend a lot of time with that. We're going to come back to Ingersoll and talk about his fight over control of the river that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. We're going to talk about that. So over the next couple of sessions, that'll be the first thing that we focus on. Let's talk about Ingersoll. Ingersoll came out of Milledgeville. He was originally from New York. He was a doctor who was a surgeon in the War of 1812. Very brilliant man, very talented man. He came down to Georgia to be a part of this westward expansion. He lived in Milledgeville. He served in the Georgia legislature, and he lived with Sieben Jones, which El Dorado in Columbus, the house that is the backdrop for St. Elmo story, with Sieben Jones' house, and we'll talk a lot about him. But Sieben Jones came down, Ingersoll came down. A lot of these guys came down from Milledgeville because they saw what was happening as Columbus developed, and a lot of it was focused on the Alabama side. John, you want to talk a little bit about these men and what they did in Milledgeville and how they got down here, and let's go from there.
Well, I guess maybe Sieben Jones is probably the one I know the most about. And I mean, he'd been a congressman, and had served in the state legislature.
As had Ingersoll.
You're right.
Yeah, both of them.
You the Ingersoll. I mean.
Well, and I'm going to let you talk, but then Ingersoll and Sebring Griggs actually had the first ferry that went back and forth across the river at close to the Dillingham Street Bridge. So these guys had ties going way back and were very influential here.
Yeah. I think what Sieben Jones represents is that Georgian who sees opportunity over here, and he's going to come to do what he's always done, which has been very much involved in politics, and he is very much a lawyer. You know, I mean, that's his primary job or activity. Okay, so he comes and he builds the house that you mentioned that he called El Dorado, and later it's called St. Elmo, and it's still standing there. And people see that and they say, oh, that's a plantation house. Well, it's not a plantation house. Sieben Jones owned lots of land, lots of slaves, but he wasn't growing cotton out there. Those houses out in Winton, they're suburban houses. But the point that we're talking about is, why did he come? Well, he came particularly here. He could have gone other places, but he came here because of the river and the power of the river. And Sieben Jones will be the first to harness the river in terms of, he built City Mills in 1828. And don't see Sieben Jones out there, running the grist mill. He's the owner. It appears that most of the time he probably even leased it out. But what's important there is him seeing the potential of the river and coming to exploit the river. And that's what a lot of these people that we're talking about. That certainly is true of Ingersoll also.
it's interesting because when the city mills, which still sits there today, and it's often talked about as the first grist mill on the river, but it wasn't actually. The first grist mill was on the Girard side, and the Niles brothers built it. We'll come back to it in a minute. And part of that mill is still standing today. But when you know where City Mills is on the northern side of town, and you have to start, let's use this map. We'll refer to it several times today. When you look at the river, and we're going to get to how Girard was formed, and here's Columbus, but there's green space all the way around Columbus. And what happens here is this green space here disappears. This is still where your parks are on the south side of Columbus, where the Coliseum is and the ball fields and Golden Park. So it's still somewhat of a green space. This green space, greed replaced it, and so the whole idea of a green space disappeared when the railroads came in, because this was a logical place to build your railroads. Then you had another northern green space. What were these called, Johnny? What called
Commons.
Green? Commons areas.
Commons.
And what Sieben Jones did is he developed City Mills right on the outside of this green space. So he's not controlled by the city. He's got a lot more control. There's also a good fall here. But we're going to talk about how Ingersoll ended up getting a part of this land early on. And guess where his land is? Directly across. Ingersoll gets all of this land, which is now up 4th Avenue, the flat land where he farmed. And then up on the top of the hill where First Baptist Church is, which is where he lived up there. That was called, as I mentioned before, we talk about Ingersoll Hill being out in the area of where the studio is that we're filming from. And it is Ingersoll Hill, but that was a later Ingersoll Hill. The original Ingersoll Hill, what you read about in a history book, don't get confused. In the history book, Ingersoll Hill was Floyd's Hill continuing on up to where the Civil War battles were fought. And one of the things when we talk about Ingersoll, he got this after the Treaty of 1832, which created the opportunity for Girard to form. But originally, Ingersoll is at the top of Dillingham Street, where the churches were. He has a trading post with the Indians. He always had a great relationship with the Indians. And beyond that, when 1832, which is the Treaty of Casita, or the final treaty, there were many Indian treaties, but it was sort of the final one, and I think there was a 6-year span that the land was to be sold and the Indians were actually moved out west. When I talk about this, I'm going to talk about my European ancestors coming into this area too, because that's the story I know. I'm also part Indian, so I've got both sides of this story, so don't think I'm leaning one way or the other. I understand both sides, and I have empathy for both sides. But these guys come to Columbus because this river's so powerful. It's as we talked last time, this is the furthest point north. It's at the fall line that you can navigate the river. And it's also this tremendous power generated here. So Sieben Jones built his mill here. After the Treaty of 1832, Ingersoll immediately gets Section 11, which is this section right here, plus some additional sections sold to him, and he builds his complex here. Now let's take a few side stories. He had to communicate off the top of this hill. Now he's a surgeon, he's a land speculator. Both of these guys were land speculators, and Shorter and a lot of these other people that came from Milledgeville and here were land speculators. They knew that this was coming, and they wanted to buy this land and resell it. Ingersoll had to communicate off the top of this hill down to his production areas. He had a grist mill down here. He had a lumber sawmill down here, and they were moved in 2 or 3 different places, some of which you can still see today. Now, the story goes that Ingersoll is given, a lot of people say Ingersoll actually created the Morse code as a means or a version that the Morse code was built off of, a signaling system where he could communicate from his home down to his overseers and the people that was working. He had cattle down here, he had crops down here. There's actually, if you go right past Riverview and you start going up 4th Avenue and you look to your right, which all that was his land, you see a tremendous pecan orchard through there. Pecan trees didn't come in, John, I think you taught me a turn of the century.
Yeah, after the turn of the century.
Yeah, and it may have been after he had sold that land, but you had pecan trees planted all down through here. But to communicate back and forth, he had to develop a system, and there's a lot of, we don't know, but you want to talk a little bit about the supposed stagecoach ride with Morris? You remember that story? We don't know if it's true or not, but
I guess Morris was riding with somebody, and he said that he had come up with the idea when he was visiting a southern plantation.
Yeah.
And I don't know, was it specific to say to this area, or was it just sort of
yeah,
general?
you're right. It wasn't specific, but then other people said it was Ingersoll. And this is interesting because Ingersoll who was the owner of what eventually is called the Mott House? Was it Griffin that was in the telecommunication business?
Right. Yeah.
And he and Ingersoll were big buddies too. All these kind of tie together. We don't know the exact
Well, yeah.
fact.
I think the Griffin thing is what strengthens it.
Yeah.
Because he was one of the owners, and he was one of the directors of the Washington to New Orleans telegraph line.
Yeah.
And so that's what
Really
gives a little more credence to the story.
And John, in some of his writings, has written about, and he's done a lot of the work on the Mott House, and talked about that Ingersoll and Mott, talked about that they had a boats that they visited back and forth across the river. There's a lot of interesting history right there. But Jones gave Ingersoll permission to build a wing dam. Now, a wing dam doesn't go all the way across the river. It just goes to the middle of the river and pushes water into your mill. And so he built this wing dam. And it existed for years, and things changed, and it ended up in a big dispute when the water lots were sold. John's an expert on the water lots among so many other things. John, you want to talk a little bit about what the water lots were and how this conflict that created between them and Ingersoll and the fight?
Well, let's go back to mention the most important thing.
Okay.
The most important thing in the history of Phoenix City, and the most important, really, maybe in Columbus too, was the fact that Alabama had no right to use the river. Alabama had no what's called riparian right. Riparian right gives you the right to use water and return it to the river, which means, like when we're talking about a fall, you can take the water off the river, you run it through earlier water wheels, later turbines, and you just send it back to the river. And that's usually your right if you own the banks, both banks of the river. But here what happens is that Georgia in 1802 gave up their western lands, and their western lands consisted of Alabama and Mississippi. And what had happened is that the Georgia legislature had sold lands in that area, and it's called the Yazoo lands, and it was become so fraudulent that it becomes the Yazoo land frauds. And what happens is that there was bribery, and they actually, lots got sold multiple times. And so there were several owners of the same land. Got all this court cases and all of that. Well, now here's the thing. Everything comes down to politics.
And money.
And money, well, yeah. I mean, that's obvious, yeah. And what happens is that this land is not sold to Georgians. It's sold, or some of it is, but a lot of it is sold out of the state, like to New York companies and companies other places, and they are getting this land, like I said, in certain cases through corruption, through bribes, and those people tended to be Federalist. And the Federalists, the two-party system is emerging, and the Federalists are Hamilton's buddies. They tend to be the elite and
Central government focused.
yeah, central government, give the federal government more power. And so and then the other group that emerges against them is going to be Jefferson, Madison, and they are called really by historians Jeffersonian Republicans. Now, when you say Republicans, it gets confused because those Republicans are going to become Democrats later on. Yeah. But we don't need to do that. But they're for the little guy.
And states' rights.
And states' rights. And more for agriculture than industry, although I'm not totally sure about that. But look at it this way. These Federalist, elite sort of folks want the land to be sold to benefit land speculators. These guys weren't buying big hunks of land out there to go settle on it. They were buying it at cheap prices to then sell it to little guys and make money off of it and sell it to settlers. Whereas Jeffersonian Republicans don't want that. They want the land opened, cheap, and let the little guys go. And like we were talking the other day, I mean, Jefferson, Madison, what we're talking about is how you're going to develop the West again.
Right.
How are you going to develop this land, which is obviously going to become a territory and originally and then going to become a state? And so what the Jeffersonian Republicans want are little guys out there who are going to vote for them.
That's right.
Later on, electoral votes. So what ends up in Georgia is this fight between the Federalists, who really were a minority, and the Jeffersonian Republicans. And so you got a couple of things going on. You got those land frauds, and here's Georgia with all this complicated, just a quagmire from this land sales, and they want to get rid of that.
Could I add something too?
Yeah.
They're also a growing state, so they're cash poor to begin with. They got economic development issues. They're struggling for money to start with, and then you lay on top of it, they got to provide restitution for some of these guys that got ripped off. They got money problems. They have serious money problems.
Yeah.
To your point.
Yeah, and so what's going to happen is this is getting pretty esoteric, but Georgia tries to get the federal government to take this problem and deal with it, and they try it during the Federalists being in power, and that's John Adams. Mm-hmm. And the Federalists won't touch it because they like that, because their guys are out there potentially going to end up making some money. But when Jefferson becomes president, it goes a totally different direction. And what's interesting to me is, I guess because I discovered it last week, was that James Madison, Jefferson's Secretary of State, actually signed the deal. Now, talking a lot about deals these days, okay? This deal is interesting because you see Alabama, people of Phoenix City, they're not at the table.
That's right.
They don't have any rights. The people at the table are the Georgians, and I don't know that James Madison sat there, but James Madison certainly knew what was going on. Mm-hmm. And what you've got is you've got Jeffersonian Republicans in power after 1801 in Washington, and you've got Jeffersonian Republicans who kicked out Federalists in Georgia because of the corruption, and they go sit down. And Georgia says, we want this, 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 this. And they say, fine. So the federal government says, we'll take care of all the land fraud business. We'll give you $1.25 million. And this is a biggie now.
This is the biggie.
No. This is next to the biggie. And that is, we are going to remove, the federal government will take care of moving Indians out of Georgia.
Georgia, not Alabama.
Not Alabama, but Georgia.
Correct.
Which is going to give the right to some of these later governors to press so hard to get them removed. And then the thing for Phoenix City is, and who knows why, and this is a mystery, the agreement says the border of Georgia will go all the way to the high water mark of Alabama.
And my perception's always been that they had to give all this up, and they needed the money because they got that money and they needed that money desperately. And again, they have to pay back some of this fraud. They gave that up because they saw the power of that river, and that was the only thing. They're giving up a lot. They're getting money that they're going to have to spend immediately just to get out of debt, but now they're going to control that river legally.
Rodney, this is a good spot. Let's stop. We really enjoyed it. For Channel 7, I'm Steve Abbott, and these distinguished guests that we've got here, Rodney Hinton and John Lupo. We've really enjoyed, I mean, I've just learned so much today. It's just been awesome. And thank you again, guys.
Thank you.
Till next week, stay tuned.